We are just going to start. I see that everybody is, almost everybody is muted and video off. Linda, on your iPad, your video is on. You might want to turn that off, because that's my first slide. So welcome everybody. Let's start first with how we use Zoom. So Zoom is obviously also new to me. You could just see I knocked myself out earlier. So I'm still practicing how to use it. But for this webinar purpose, keep your audio and video off, just so that you can have all the stream coming from my side. If you want to pop a question, just put it in the chat. I've got the chat open, yeah, and I will try to get to it right away, but it might be that I'm not seeing it. So in that case, just unmute and interrupt me and ask your question, okay? Because sometimes I have to click the chat away in order to see my Lightroom. So if I don't see it, then just interrupt me. And yeah, if you want to see my video, first click on the selection of videos, pin my video so that you see just me, and then you can click this middle one so that all the boxes of the other videos, which are anyway off, are gone, right? So later we can try and do a group photo again, and there you can see there's a gallery view where you can pop them all up, but as soon as all the videos are turned off, you don't really want to look at that. So for those who are experienced with Lightroom, for those who've already worked last week on it, you can have your Lightroom open. My suggestion is you use the switch window function that you see I'll be using between Zoom and PowerPoint and Lightroom. And essentially it's just Command Tap, or on Windows it's Control Tap, and that allows you to switch windows. So while I'm explaining something, you can just switch window, take that in your Lightroom and switch back. That's one way of doing it. You can also organize your image, if you have enough space on your screen, you can put Lightroom on one side and Zoom on the other side. It's up to you, but that allows you to follow essentially what I'm doing in Lightroom. But it is a lot of things. So if you're familiar, if you know where it is, go for it. But otherwise, the recording's going to be available tomorrow. Just go step by step through it tomorrow. Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to say this because there's a few new people. My name is Simon. I live in Hong Kong, underwater photographer, and amongst other things, I try to be a photo coach. So I like to help people with their photography, and this is essentially part of it. Insider Divers is my travel company. We basically do any kind of scuba diving trip, land-based to liveaboard. We do also specialized trips such as rec or tech trips, as well as free diving trips, and obviously we do photography workshops. All of our trips are group trips. There's always some sort of expert with you, so either me or somebody else, an instructor, a photographer, or two of us might be. We'll always try to make a specialized itinerary, so we always have a few specials there that are maybe otherwise hard to organize. And we really want everybody to learn a little bit, at least a little bit, on every trip. So we do talks. We organize talks of scientists or photographers or whoever is in that area and has something interesting to share, or I will do some talks, because we believe you should never stop learning. So that was my pitch. Let's go straight into Lightroom editing. So for those who joined last week, and I hope everybody who's here watched the YouTube video, that was just the basics, how you organize and how you orient yourself in Lightroom. Now we're actually going to talk about Lightroom editing. And let me start right with a photo from this last trip. It was actually a real big moment for me. It wasn't my first blue whale, but it was my first really good blue whale, and there was a diver, and it was a really large blue whale. But you can see, obviously, I'm shooting without strobes, so everything is slightly blue and green, even though the white balance is pretty accurate. But after a few clicks in Lightroom, we can basically get all the color back and add sharpness to it. And essentially, that's what I want to show you today. So just where we're at, last week was part one. Now we're talking today about all the main editing features: white balance and lighting, color management, and detail editing. That includes sharpening. Next week, we're going to talk about partial editing. We're also going to put crop and light scatter in there. And I'll try to cover watermark. And then the last part, which is in 2 weeks, we're going to essentially cover all kinds of special things and any questions that you guys send me, so we can do some more interesting things. So today, Lightroom Part 2, we're going to talk about a couple of settings that I would like you guys to put onto your Lightroom, or at least you can choose to. I'm going to do one sentence or one slide on batch editing and show you one little trick that that you need to activate in terms of settings. And then we'll spend quite a bit of time on white balance and color management, just because that is where I believe you can make your pictures really beautiful, and lots of people are not making full use of the potential of Lightroom. We're also going to talk about brightness and darkness, essentially contrast and exposure, and sharpening. And I'm going to do that on the hand of a couple of different examples. So let's talk first about setup. So we're in the develop mode. As you remember last week, we were always in the library mode. Now we're in the develop mode. And if you look at my screen here, you can already see that on the right, there is a little bit less or a little bit different information than what you might see in your Lightroom setup. So I'm going to give you a couple of pointers on what things I activate, but I'm going to show you that in the program, so don't do it now. Also, again, I would like to invite you guys to start using shortcuts. Last time we just used a couple of numbers and then obviously X for mark as rejected. Today, I want you to start working on copy paste, super important for batch editing. Also, Command Z or Control Z for undo is extremely important. Try to start using these. If you ask me where they are, I can probably find them in the menu, but everybody who edits photos will tell you that you need to use shortcuts. So I'm gonna have this little program on that you remember from last time, which essentially tells you, what I'm pressing. So I just activated it with Command 9. And so let's say I'm pressing the next slide. You can see it now says in the bottom left what I am pressing. Okay, I'm just gonna turn that off because we don't need it right now. So first thing we're going to talk about that is batch editing, and I'm putting it in the settings part because you need to do something. So if you shoot a series, so there's a couple people here from Roger Ampot. I can see Faye here, for example, right? You remember this was on our last day. We had this fabulous ball of yellow fish, and I shot a lot of photos, maybe 50 or 60 photos, and obviously you start editing one and you get the white balance right. And so you can see here, nice, crisp, yellow, etc. But that is the result of quite a bit of fine tuning. Now you've done it once. The beauty is in Lightroom that you can copy that. So with Command C, or if you're on Windows, Control C, you can copy everything. Oh, okay. Arnaud, thank you. I saw that. I will update that. Thank you. You press Command C and you copy all of your settings that you've applied to this image. Now, the ones that we're going to discuss today are here on the left, but essentially it doesn't matter. You can just copy everything. And then you go to your series of photos and you can paste it on one or on multiple. You can paste it on 50 photos if you like. And essentially then you have a great starting point. Then you only need to fine tune. You can see now in the bottom, all the fish look yellow in all the images. And then you just have to fine tune a little bit. You can see the ball of fish is a bit further away in one photo. So I'm going to have to do a bit of fine tuning, but you can save yourself a lot of work if you do batch editing. However, there's one stupid thing about Lightroom, and that is the auto sync that needs to be enabled. And it is really cumbersome to get to. So I'm going to show you how to do it. But essentially in develop mode, we're going to mark two photos with shift so that they're both marked. And then we go into settings and then we have to click enable auto sync. So I'll show you how to do that. And everybody who's got Lightroom on, I suggest you also do that, because I always found it hard to find when I wasn't doing it so regularly. Okay, so I'm going to switch over into Lightroom and show you these couple of things. So I'm just going to go right into develop mode. And in develop mode, you can now see that I've organized my right side. This is where all the music is for developing, in a way that everything we're going to do today is visible in one go. And I want to show you how you can set that up so you don't have to click at things that are unnecessary. Okay, so when you get your program, let me just set that back here to how it was. So when you open your program, it looks like this. So you've got a histogram up here, then you've got something, then you've got a tone curve, and actually I find that both the histogram and the tone curve are rather technical, and I've never really enjoyed using those. So I'm going to make them go away. I'm just going to zoom in. I hope everybody can see that here. So the histogram, unfortunately, they love the histogram. They want you to keep it, so they don't let you like take it away all the way, but you can put the caret pointing left and then it's going to be gone. So this one, you want to be pointing to the left. And then on basic, or any of these other topics, you need to do a right mouse click and go to Customize Development Panel. And here is this Customize Develop Panel. And essentially here you can untick what you don't want. And tone curve and split toning are both things that I don't use, and I think you're not going to use it either. So just save that, and then you will see that on the right side you now have everything that you're going to need today: your basic settings, your white balance, your exposure contrast, texture, which we're going to be using for sharpening, and then your HSL, your hue, saturation, and luminance, which in essence, that is everything we're going to be doing today. So that was the one thing that you should be doing. And for the other one, you need to, as I said, you need to essentially mark two photos together. So you can press Shift and just click on another photo. Now you can see there's 3 selected here. And when you have 3 selected, then you click into Settings, and you have to press this button, Enable Auto Sync. Now, if you can remember, you can also do Shift, Option, Command A. That's a bit too much for me. Once it's more than 2, I generally forget it. So you only have to tick it this one time. So whoever has Lightroom, I suggest you do that this one time, and then you never have to think about that again. Essentially, what this allows you to do now is to copy the settings from one. So you see, I just copied these settings. I haven't edited anything yet, but all of these settings here, you can see copy settings. That was Command C. I copied those, and now I could paste them onto multiple photographs. Right? So with Command V, I would now paste them, and you would see that that gets pasted on all of them. Okay, so those were the settings that I wanted you guys to do. So I would now start with the actual white balance. Did everybody get that, or are there questions on these 2 settings? Okay, I don't hear any questions. Otherwise, you can come back to that one later. All right, white balance. Now, white balance is super important because white balance is where you make a beautiful photo or not. And so that's why I've spent quite a bit of time today on that. What is color balance? The balance of all colors is the intensities of all the colors and how to interact with each other. And essentially, what it is all a mixture of red, green, and blue. RGB. You recognize we talked about this last time, sRGB and Adobe RGB and all that. And essentially what that is all the colors that we see digitally are mixed out of 3 colors, red, green, and blue. And you can see the other 3 colors, magenta, yellow, and this sort of cyan or aqua, they call it in Lightroom, are mixed out of these prime colors. And the entire rainbow, or spectral colors, is all mixed out of these RGBs. So what essentially is a balanced photo? Well, a balanced photo is when the neutral colors look natural. So in underwater, we've kind of decided to call that white balance. In photography and video, sometimes they call it gray balance. I've also seen some people call it neutral balance. Essentially, what it means is when you've color corrected your photo, everybody says, oh, nice, now it's all nice and yellow. But that's actually not what we're looking at first. The first thing we're looking at is if our whites are white or if they are more blue-green. So if you look in detail on these squirrelfish, was also in Raja Ampat here, if you look in detail on the colors, you can see that here they are blue-green and here they are white. So that tells you that the left side is the one that's white balance and the right side is how it came out of the camera. So essentially that's the one that you can look at, and the other one is that your grays are actually gray and not blue-green. Again, same, if you look at this barracuda, on the right side you've got the untouched image and you can see that the grays are blue-green, and you can see on the left, okay, there's some reds and some yellows as well, but essentially you can see that we've got a lot of grays in here. That's where this white balance card comes in, and I think that's why they call it white balance underwater, because in most cases you would use a white balance card to set your white balance. This is very old school because essentially back in the day when digital photography was new, essentially you had to do this white balancing because all the photos that came out were JPEG. But here's your myth buster number two. Number one today, you do not need to white balance underwater. You can, but you don't have to do that. Lots of people spend lots of time on that. It's a total waste of time because you're shooting in RAW. Last time already we discussed, you should be shooting in RAW, and the reason for that is how the pictures are detected. So here's a slightly scientific graph of essentially how each pixel is recorded. Each pixel is recorded with a part of the sensor, which is 1 pixel on the sensor, and there's 3 filters, and these 3 color filters basically say how much of each of the 3 light main colors is coming through, and that gets put into a pattern which essentially gets represented in a RGB code. So it's from 0 to 255 on RGB, so you can imagine 255 times 255 times 255 is quite a lot of options, and that is your color code. Now, when you're shooting in RAW, all of that information is retained. So you're shooting it, and it is actually available as all your information is blues, reds, and greens for every pixel that is on your sensor. So if you've got a camera like Michael with a D850, that's a 50 megapixel sensor. So you've got 50 million pixels that tell you I'm red, green, blue, variation. Essentially, if you shoot in JPEG, you're skipping that. And the camera says, nope, I'm going to make one finished picture right away. And it doesn't retain this individual information. That's why we've all agreed last time already, we're shooting everything in RAW if we can. And here's one of the main reasons, because we've got much more choice with our colors. Mythbuster number 2, it is actually your decision what colors you like and how you want them to look like. Essentially, most people, including myself, like to make the look whites white, and 1 second, Daz. You want to make the whites look white and the grays look gray, but it is your decision. You can make it look whatever, because when we go down there, actually nothing looks red, yellow, etc. Because as you guys know from your PADI training or whatever certification agency you're working with, down there we do not have any red light. We have almost no orange light and yellow light, which means everything looks blue-green. So it's your decision if you want to do it realistically. Realistically is on the left. This is how it's shot. It's a little bit white balance in the camera, but not much. You can see it's slightly greenish, and essentially that's what we see underwater. So it's our decision if we want to keep it that way or if we want to do it like this. This is what most photographers, including myself, would like to which is essentially making the reds look red, the yellows look yellow, and the blue background look blue, because that color is available, so we would like to do it. But if you would like it to look like this, then you should be able to do that, because it's your decision. It's all just a representation of what it looks down there, and it is up to you what you want to do with it. But I'm going to teach you how to do the white balancing as it is in the middle, obviously. Daz, your question about switching between screens is Command Tap. You can switch between the screens, and you have to press it a second time. Then you will see the other program. So with that, you can switch forwards and backwards. Okay, I'm going to tell you one other thing. If you want to do photography more, and if you want to use all the beauty of the colors that we have down there, you're going to have to use a strobe. As you know, down there is just no more red light and blue and orange light. So everything looks green, and essentially there are tricks on how to change it. But better is if you use a strobe, because now you've got the distance between the subject and your light source is maybe 0.5 meter or 1 meter, which essentially means you've got all the spectral colors, including all the punchy reds and oranges, still available, because the light is only traveling this far. So even if you only have a small strobe, is better than no strobe. So consider getting one of those. So I'm going to give you 3 steps on how to color balance, and I'm sure most of you have figured out the first 2 already, which is set your white balance and then fine tune with temperature and tint. Oh, I was just corrected. So switching on Windows is not Command Tap, it's Alt Tap. Okay, thank you, Pedro. The third step is color management. And color management is essentially something that comes further down in the program, but this is where you make the picture perfect. And that's why I'm going to show you all of these 3 steps before we go into the simple stuff of contrast and brightness, etc. So we're going to start with the white balance in Lightroom, and you're going to see this icon. Again, I'm going to show you all of this in the program. And what you're going to have to find is this white balance selector tool, or I call it the white balance picker. And with that, you want to find a neutral area. And neutral is somewhere close to 50-50-50, which is essentially dark gray. 50-50-50 is the code in RGB, and you will see down here in the selector window that it will give you these indicators, and you don't have to get it exact. All you want to do is maybe not do 10, 90, 75. Then it will give you a nice first grab at this image. You can see it's maybe a bit pink, but looks pretty good for a starting point, right? So if you get some sharks of any sort with a little bit of strobe light on, actually is a perfect subject to color grade, because they've got perfect gray grading here on the side of their head. So in this area, if you click anywhere there, you're going to get a pretty nice first starting point for your whale shark or shark. Now, the reason I also don't think white balance cards are very good is if you use the white of a white belly of a manta ray, which essentially really is white. If you use that, what you're going to get is a slightly more reddish picture. And that is one thing that I'm going to show you later how you correct. So you can still use this area of the white body, or maybe better is if you use this gray area, and you'll get a more accurate representation. So then we come to the next step, which is essentially fine-tuning with temperature and tint. What is temperature? Essentially, that's the color temperature of the light, right? Underwater, we're obviously much more in the blue area, right? So we can set our camera to get a little bit closer into that area. So generally, I set my pictures, my camera to set somewhere here, 5,400, where the flash photography is. But it doesn't matter. You can change that later in the program because you're shooting raw. But essentially, what you're getting here is just the blues and the yellows. So you're editing the part. If you look here on the right side, guys, what you're editing is basically the blue overlap with the red and the green, creating three main colors, essentially the variations between blue and yellow. And you can imagine what you do with the tint. With the tint, you're going to be panning between red and green. And essentially, these four extremes also set your white balance. So that's why it is in one window. The white balance picker just gives you a good starting point, and you need to fine tune it yourself. So how do you fine tune it? Generally, you want to be looking at the whites or at the grays, and you want to be playing with those dials until you pretty much get it. But if you use a white balance picker, it will give you a good starting point. If you don't really see what's happening, try the extremes. So just move the slider to one side or to the other side and just see what happens, right? And then you will already see which direction the picture has been taken. But if you want to go back to what the white balance picker had originally suggested, you just double click on either the word temp or tint or on this little controller. I'll show you in a moment how to do that, right? So these are the two first steps, and let's just do those on a couple of examples. I'm going to switch over to Lightroom. So I've imported a couple more photos, but actually why not? Let's just start with an easy one, which would be the whale shark. Which one should we take? Just going to take this one here, yeah, and I'm going to go into develop mode. I'm going to move this over, and now my awesome zoom function here is going to allow me to do this right next to here. So here's the white balance picker, that, or the white balance selector tool. You can also press W to get there. You click on this, and essentially once you move it over the colors, you will see that the RGB in the bottom are moving around, right? And as I mentioned, you want to get it somewhere in the vicinity of 50-50-50, like here. And once you click that, boom, you already get a pretty nice white belly. Let's just have a look what this looks like out here. You can get already a pretty nice white belly, but the blues are still not quite there, and this is still a bit aqua, but essentially we'll get there. So that was step one. And now I would play with my white balance here, with my temperature and my tint. So I'm just looking at the white. Don't look at the blues, not at the greens. And all I'm doing is I'm moving it until I feel like I'm hitting what is as white as possible that I can do with these two colors. These are the two ingredients of white. So for example here, and I'm going to do the same with tint. See, that gets a bit green, that gets a bit red, and essentially somewhere here is where I want to be. Okay, so here you can see now that this is already quite good. Lots of people will be happy with that, but I'm going to show you another step a little bit later that allows us to make this color here also look like whale shark and the blue look more blue. Yeah, so let's just do maybe one other example. People, right? So people are really, really easy, because people, all you need to do essentially, so this was in Komodo last year. All you need to do is put the white balance picker somewhere on the skin. So here, for example, and you will see, okay, this turned out a bit too blue, but usually the skin is quite a good starting point to fine tune your white balance. And you can see now already looks pretty good. Okay, so these are the two first steps, which are literally just here in the first top part of Lightroom. So before we go to color management, are there any questions on this? You can put that in the group chat, or you just turn on your audio and let me know your question. But I think it's pretty straightforward. No? Okay. So then we come to color management. And here is where essentially you're going to make this picture beautiful. This is where you decide if it's going to be awesome or not. And that is, for example, making the blues more blue. And making all the other colors exactly how we want them to be. Chef just asked 50-50 RGB, 50-50-50. It's 3 letters. Okay, so if you have 50-50-50, you basically have a dark gray. So you can play around with that. As I said, it doesn't have to be there, but it's a good starting point. So color management, what we can do in color management, essentially we can edit all of our colors individually, which allows us to do all the things we want and avoid all the things we don't want. The advantage, again, because we're shooting raw. So we come to HSL, or hue, saturation, and luminance. So hue, saturation, and luminance is essentially 3 levels of how you can edit each pixel. Again, this is going to look a little bit technical. Hue is essentially if you are on one point of your color dial, if you want it to move slightly more towards the next color on the other side of the spectrum or in the other direction. Essentially, if you're a blue, you can tell blue, I want this blue to be a bit more magenta, or I want it to be a bit more cyan, or cyan is called aqua in Lightroom. So this is what hue is. It tells you where do you want that color to go. The second thing is saturation and luminance. Saturation and luminance are essentially, again, for the color that you've now picked with your hue. So if you decided that your RGB value for this pixel is this particular color, with saturation, you can increase the intensity of that color. And with luminance, you can increase the brightness or darkness from that color. Yeah, somebody is Johanna. We can hear you. Did you want to ask a question? Okay, I'm just going to mute you. Okay, I do see here a question. Manjula, you're saying not that much variance on the 50-50-50. Let's just get back to it when I'm back in Lightroom, okay? Okay, so here is an example. This is a photo taken in very shallow water in Rajampat with very bright daylight, which means there's a lot of good light. So you can see already that the color is relatively good without much editing. But once I've done the hue, I can have basically decided that I want my blues to be blue and my aquas to be aqua. This is something that we can do with the hue. And now watch what happens when I increase the saturation of my blues. If I go forward and backwards, you can see my blues are changing, but my orange of the coral is not changing at all. Right? And now if I would desaturate, you could see I can actually make all of the blues disappear. It looks a bit odd, but it just shows you what I'm doing. If you keep looking at the orange coral, you can see when I'm flicking between the different saturation levels, you can see the orange coral stays exactly the same. Also, I can make the blue brighter and the blue darker. So that is a choice. As you can see while I'm flicking through this, the orange in the foreground is not changing at all. And that is because all I'm changing is the blues. So earlier I made this photo with the manta ray and I said that there's too many reds in there and the blues are looking not that attractive. So here are some changes that we're going to do in hue, and you will see that down here this slider is extremely useful. Okay, and essentially aqua, which is cyan, that is exactly the color mix between green and blue. So when we tell that color to be more blue, essentially everything that we find looking too greenish will move towards blue, and you can see here in the background that we're getting a nice solid blue. The side effect is very often that we will get also reds, because the next one from blue is purple or magenta essentially. So therefore what we get very often is sort of a red and orange tinge, but that we can change in saturation. If we reduce the saturation on these red colors, you can see there's sort of like a reverse saturation here. Then we keep the blues blue and the white belly of the manta ray looks white. Here's an example. I hope everybody can see that properly. Maybe it's not strong enough on every screen, particularly if you're looking on a phone. But if you look on the left, we've got the ball of the snappers, yeah, and the I think they're called humphead snappers or humpback snappers. And then we've got a couple of yellow sweet lip snappers in between. On the left, I've punched up the red and orange and I've reduced the yellow. So what we see on the left are primarily the red fish. On the right, I've reduced the reds and the oranges and I've increased the yellows. So now the yellows pop out. Now, I'm not saying that this is what you should do, but just to show what you can do and what choices you've got when you play with saturation. Here's an example for red saturation with putting up red and orange just by like a quarter or a third. You're actually getting really, really extreme red colors. I'm doing this very extreme, not because I want you to do it that extreme, but just because I want you to get closer to the photo that you can see here in the back, yeah, where we have all these nice colors. Essentially, that is what we want to try to get to, and you need to edit your colors individually to do that. So I'm going to switch back into Lightroom, and I'm going to start with white balancing Manjula just to show you what I mean with the 50-50-50. And I'm saying it's just a starting point, right? It's not accurate. It's just a starting point because it helps you just get an area where you want to start with. So I'm just going to click on, what should we take? Let's just do the whale shark. So we've done the whale shark. I'm here in the develop mode. Let me just reset this one more time. So we're going to start afresh. So if I'm going here with the white balance picker, you can see that when I'm going relatively close to 50-50-50, then I am getting a relatively reasonable color. Let me see if I can get pretty close to it. That's quite hard to find. Maybe here, right? Once I click that, you can see now that the white belly looks pretty white. Now, if you've taken your photos with your white balance, so the way you set your white balance in your camera, completely off to the green or completely off into the blue, then this won't work. So if your photos needs to be roughly in the right area so that this will work. So that might be one of the problems you were having there. But Manjula, just send me your raw and I will play with it for the next session. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, we did this fine tuning, like a little bit less reds here maybe. One thing that is really annoying me in this whale shark is the top of the body here is very blue-green. And essentially that is what we're going to fix now. I just need to move some of those windows around. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in and we're just going to go here over to the color so that everybody can see that. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is move the aqua slider from aqua towards blue. So if you click it to 50%, you can already see the difference. I'm going to click this back one more time. You can see here that we've got all of this aqua now is essentially disappearing and the blue background is getting more blue. It's a double bonus. You see, this is already a very, very nice result. Now we're going to go to saturation. And in saturation, we can make all of the rest of this aqua. I mean, I find this is actually good enough, but I'm going to show you what you can do. If you're reducing the aqua further, so just the saturation of aqua, you can see that now the body is fully gray. There's no more, excuse me, there's no more aqua left in here. And that makes the body really, really nice. So I'm going to show you one trick. I mean, I essentially just either press reset in the bottom right-hand corner. So if you press reset, it will show you, it will set everything back to normal and you will see what your picture was before. And then you can do, just activate the shortcuts. You can do Command Z to undo your settings. And then you see what it is now. So you do reset and Command Z to go back. That's one way of looking at it. Another one is you can press the slash or backslash, and backslash essentially will go back to the original. That's another way of looking at it. Or down here, bottom left, you can see this one here essentially will split the image right and left, and it will show you the before and the after if you want to do that. So this is a way how you can assess your white balance. So that was the whale shark. And with the whale shark, oh, sorry, we're not done yet with the whale shark. Another thing that we can do in here, I'm going to zoom this in again. Another thing we can do in here is we can increase the blues. So if we want the blue background to be more blue, we can just press the blue, increase the blues, and you will see now the background is a lot bluer. I can also decide if I want this background to be darker or brighter. I'll show you in a moment what that looks like. And while we're here in the detail view, you can see here the parasites. They leave marks on the scales or on the skin of the shark. And if we want those to be redder, we could make the reds stronger and the orange stronger. Just to see, if you go left and right, you can see how you can now manipulate just the orange parts. And you could do the same with luminance. So you can make it brighter, or you could make it darker. So I don't know if that comes through, but essentially we're manipulating this orange rim here around the parasites. Right? And so here we've now color corrected this image, and we would now press Command C, yeah. And if you look in here, you can see all of our treatments is what we've actually done. We've just actually done white balance and we've done the color, but we haven't done anything else, so you might as well just copy that. Just click that. And now we can go onto our 4 other images, and with auto sync enabled, we just press Command V, and you can see all of these are now also color graded. Now you can see that if they are further away from us than on the other photo, we will have to do some more fine tuning because there's a different composition in the light touching the subject. But essentially, we can just copy paste and use these settings on our other photos. So I'm just going to take a more extreme example because Michael asked me to also edit his photo. So ladies and gentlemen, this is a photo from 40 meters in Dubai. Very greenish water. And Michael asked me on how to edit this green. So I'm going to come back to the pixelation that you've got, the ISO noise, because you shot this at ISO 2000. So you've got some pixels. Let's ignore the pixels for now. We're just going to look at the colors, right? And if we're going to do color correction on this, essentially you need to decide, do you want it to be looking blue or do you want it to look green? And I think either way is good. So I'm going to show you blue first. When you have a person that is lit by the strobe, I always do the color correction on the person. So here, when we're now going, I'm just going to zoom in so you can see that. So I'm just moving it. Somebody just asked that. I'm just moving it over different things, and you can see how the RGB is changing when the color picker. I'm not clicking anything. I'm just going over it. And I could also go on the white here, for example. You see that's also quite close to the 50-50-50. But if I were to go on the green, you can see it's 30-40-30 more like it. So that's not a good area. If you've got a person, it's generally a good spot to do your white balancing. So I'm going to pick that. And you can see that now the face of this diver already looks pretty good. The skin is slightly reddish. That is pretty good. We've got some red in here, so we're going to have to fix that. And our overall color already has changed quite a bit. Okay, Michael, I'm just going to do finish blue, and then we're going to do green, because I agree with you. I would also make it green. So let me just finish how I would do this one to make it blue. So you could now move, again, the aqua over, and now you could decide to take out the aqua or increase the aqua. If you increase the aqua in saturation and your blues, you can actually make a relatively blue photo out of it, right? So you can make this a bit darker perhaps, right? And now you actually have, if we do a bit more vibrance perhaps, which is the intensity of the colors, we're going to do a little bit more here. Then you can see we've actually got you could pretend to have a blue background, right? If I were not using the white, because white, as I will tell you in a moment, essentially there's no picture information here. Gray is much better for white balance because white, you have to actually be able to see something that is white. White light is, as I'll show you later, there's actually no picture information in this white. So we can't really use that. But you can see now we've created a blue image, and I'm going to show you a little trick. So if you look here on the left, now I'm going to click on this image and I am going to create a virtual copy. Now what this does is it creates the same photo one more time, but because we've got Lightroom and we're not using it's not a destructive software, what it does, it just creates one more registration of your settings. And now we can reset and we could do it completely different. So here, I would still probably white balance the person to make sure that that person is looking fairly accurate, but we want this whole thing to look a bit more green. So I'm still looking at the human, making sure that the skin color looks good. And now we can do our hue, and we can move our hue into a different direction. So we can make the green look more green. So we actually tell the aqua to move towards green rather than blue. You see? And now it gets very green. And now we can increase the saturation of the green. We can reduce the aqua. No, that is not enough picture information for that. But we can make it a little bit darker, make it gloomier. Make the vibrance. And now we would have it extremely green. So here is an example for making it very green. There's a couple of other tricks I'm going to show you a little bit later. For example, using a radiant filter here for, a gradient filter for the bottom so that we could make this sharper and a bit brighter. And we could even change the color correction. So just as a trick that we're going to be discussing later, we can actually add a gradient filter to do that at the bottom, but we will be doing that a little bit later. Okay, so that was a green, and let me just maybe do the other one later. So that was our color corrections. And now before we finish with the colors, let's talk about typical variations. And variations, I just showed you how to make a virtual copy. I always suggest to make your color variations in a different, on a virtual copy so you can compare. But essentially, you could do black and white is one of the modes. And one good way of doing it, there's a black and white mode in Lightroom. I'll show you in a moment where that is. Or you can use desaturation, which gives you a couple of extra options. So first, black and white mode. So we've got a photo here. And essentially, if you want to do black and white, you need to do the following steps first. So you need to do your brightness and darkness, your sharpness and all that first before you go into white balancing. Before you go into black and white. And then you click on black and white, and in black and white mode, it allows you to do variants of your colors despite being in black and white. So a typical one is if you want your blues to be, so your background to be more dark and gloomy, or if you want them to be more bright and light. Essentially, that is something that you can do in the black and white mix. I'll show you in a moment how to do that. But if you pick the desaturation, so that means taking the saturation of the entire image and reducing it, what this allows you to do is to do sort of soft color variations. And for example, this one here, where you can see there's actually not very many colors in, but there's a light blue is still there. You can call it maybe blue steel or something like that. Is one intermediate step that you can do with black and white. Another one that you could do is single color, so you can pick up a single color without having to go into Photoshop. This is now a very quick approach. You can see there's still some orange on the head of the hammerhead, but you can see I could make a black and white image and still leave these yellow fish popping out in yellow. Now, if you want to do that, it's better if you don't click on black and white, but use desaturation mode. So I'm just going to pick an example here to use this with. Let's just take the whale shark again. So if we did the whale shark, we have to go into develop mode. Now you can see we've got our edits here. Yeah, the colors have changed. Now, if you go to the top right-hand corner, you can see that our overall treatment is called color currently. And if we click to black and white, you can see that it switches from Adobe Colors to Adobe Monochrome. That essentially means it does not look at the colors anymore. But you can still, in the bottom, you can still use your black and white mix. I'll just zoom into this guy, move it over here. So in your black and white mix, you can decide to make it a whale shark in the dark or a whale shark in the bright. Right? I think the effect is quite nice. With this whale shark where it's shot with clear water, you can see that just moving the blue up and down, you can do quite a bit of difference, and you can obviously play around the center. But for example, here, if I made a black and white out of this, I'd probably choose this. You can also use the other colors. You remember these colors from when we were editing them earlier. So you can see here what's happening to the top of the whale shark where the aqua is. We can decide to make that brighter, essentially make it look like there's more sun shining or less sun shining. Right? These are the only colors that are dominant here, so it only makes sense to play with these colors. So that is some of this variation. And I'm going to go back to color and show you the second way. Maybe we're going to use a different image for that. Let me just use this guy here, for example. So if I white balance this guy on his skin, all right, so I've done a little bit of that. like this. So let's say I've done this, and now I click on desaturating it. You can see now the whole picture is sort of in this steel kind of look, but I could decide to make certain colors pop out, like the yellow from the alternate. Oh, it's not enough. The yellow from the alternate, I can make that go in and out, or the orange from the pants, I can go make that in and out. I can also increase the brightness and darkness. So you can see now his pants, the rim of his pants is getting brighter, and also the octopus is going brighter and darker. So you can choose, reduce the blues a little bit. So you could choose to play only with these colors if you so wanted to do this effect. Okay? So that in essence were the 3 steps for color management. Before I go to the next section, by the way, these next sections are much shorter than this one. Are there any more questions that I haven't answered yet with regards to the color? So there were a couple questions that I answered already. Any other questions on colors? Okay. Yeah, Dot is saying need to practice. That's true. You just need to practice. Okay. Now the next sections are really short, but I wanted to start with the colors because they're higher up in the editing part. So the next part is brightening and darkness. Obviously, this is not as rocket sciencey as maybe you would expect, but essentially you've got a bit more option than just your brightness and darkness. You've got exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. And your brightness elements essentially are, you can do your overall exposure, you can use your highlights and your whites. These are 3 variations of creating your brightness. Generally, exposure is your general brightness of the image. So if you want to make everything brighter or everything darker, that is where you start. So here is this image I showed last week, which was this totally underexposed inside of the car wreck in Colombo, Sri Lanka. And here, obviously, everything's way too dark. I just increased the brightness, and you can see immediately that I just brighten everything. So on the left, where obviously my strobe was working, we've got now way too much brightness, but at least we've got all the detail, and that is essentially the very quick fix to do everything brighter. Now, here, for example, we make everything darker. So you can see that we've got the sunburst in the top, and it's a little bit too bright, right? Now, if I reduce my exposure by 1.5 stops, you can see here, these are stops, essentially like on your camera. So this is 1.4 stops down. You can see the sunburst looks better, but everything else gets darker. So clearly that's not the right approach here. That is because we should be using whites and highlights. And whites and highlights are a little bit different than exposure. Whites and highlights are essentially the areas of your picture where you have absolutely no picture information. And that is why earlier, Eva, when you asked if we can use the whites are essentially, they're fully white. It doesn't tell you anything about the color information. It's really, really far left on the histogram. We didn't talk about the histogram, but essentially it's the very extreme of your color selection. Whereas highlights is just below that. And that is essentially where you can see something. So when you look there in the top in the sunburst, you can see this area around the white bits. That is where we can see the surface structure, and that would be your highlights. So let's see what that looks like when we edit those. So here is when we did the exposure down, just like just now before. You can see the whole reef gets dark, and also the coral block gets dark. But if we just reduce our highlights and our whites, you can see now we get a much nicer white balance, but our blue remains the same, and our coral reef block almost looks the same as well. So that essentially is a situation where you want to use your highlights, is when you just want to edit the very brightest part of your image. Now you will see also, if you look on the left here, you can see the reef block, the Gorgonian fan has very bright structures. On the right, you will see that they're also slightly reduced, but they're further down in the highlight spectrum, so therefore they are less affected when you just use highlights and whites. The second big one is contrast. So what is contrast? I think everybody has an idea, but if you look at it technically, it's essentially the difference between the lightest and the darkest tone. And on the left, you can see a picture from the Red Sea where I've done the color correction, but I haven't done any contrast. And on the right, you see that I've done a little bit of contrast. And what you can see is not only do the subjects separate from the background, also the seafloor is much clearer. And essentially what that does is with contrast you create highlights and shadows, and you're creating more focus on the darker parts, which essentially outlines all the features a bit more. If you look at the reef, if you look at the sand, all of that looks much crisper just because the darks are darker and the brights are brighter. So that is what your contrast is. Obviously everybody's seen it because it's at the top here. But sometimes people are confused with what highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks are. Now, I've already explained what highlights and whites are. I'll tell you in a moment what shadows and blacks are. But all of these four together make your contrast. So instead of using your contrast, I usually just do it a very, very little bit. You want to be using these four to actually fine-tune what you want to do with your contrast. So here's a picture that clearly is underexposed, yeah, but here it shows very well what our blacks and our shadows are. Now, same like the whites are zero picture information, same here. We've got zero brightness. It's the full extreme in the other direction. So it's the full left side of the histogram, and essentially there is nothing that you can see in a black. In the shadows, like you can see marked here on the right, that is the segment right next to the blacks, and here we do have a little bit of structure. Essentially the viewer can see some details. What can we do with these shadows? So here you've got an underexposed photo with an octopus. I'm really showing you how crappy photos I shoot very often. You can see this this octopus, coconut octopus and lembe is totally underexposed, the whole image. But if I just increase the shadows and the blacks a little bit, all you can see is that all the details are essentially still here. Equally, if we want to make one of these black background shots, you don't really have to get it right. As long as you get the background relatively dark, you can actually increase the blacks, so make more blacks, and boom, you've already got your black background photo. So these are things that you can do with your blacks and your shadows. I want you to be a little bit careful that you don't over contrast it. Okay, so here you can see the same photo where I've done too much contrast, and if we look in detail, now what you can see is here we have quite a bit of non-detail. So the whites are bleeding out over the darks, which makes it not sharp. Equally, what you can see is that the darks here are essentially too dark and they don't look nice anymore. So you want to be careful. Whoops. You want to be careful when you do contrast. Don't do too much contrast. You don't want things to look black. So you can see here the tail, and here also this area looks way too black. You don't really want to do that. Also, when you're trying to correct your highlights, if you've done a sunburst and you haven't done it clean, you can't just punch the highlights all the way down to zero and your whites, right? Because then you get artifacts. Even though you're shooting in RAW, you're going to get these artifacts and they're essentially ugly and everybody will know what you've done. So both of these photos are not shot in the right way. And unfortunately, I mean, you can of course edit it like this, but you will see that you've got a huge ugly circle here, and every photographer who knows Lightroom will know exactly that you've actually are trying to save a photo that you've messed up. So don't overdo it. If you have done too much brightness and you get these artifacts, just don't edit that photo. Another thing that we see quite often is what we call highlight bleed. Right? Equally, the blacks can also bleed. So if the brightness is bleeding out over, so it's spilling out over the darkness, creating, in this case, a halo. You can do this in reverse as well with the blacks. Essentially, then you've done too much of it. So make sure that you don't get a bleed and that your forms all look nice and clean, like here in the bottom. This here in the top, that doesn't look good. So here you have too much highlights and too much whites. You need to reduce those. So your contrast helps to focus on the subject, and it also helps bring details back. Make sure you don't over contrast and you don't overdo the highlights and the blacks. Let's just do an example, not this one. what's a good one? Let's do this reef one from last week. All right, so I'm just gonna pick one of these. Let me just color correct that real quickly. Right, now when we look in detail here, you can see, for example, that the tips are too white. Now first I would try and do a little bit of contrast, and I usually will do a maximum of 20% so that we get some darks. Let's forget this shadow for a moment, but in here you can now see the structure. I'm just going to undo that for a moment. Maybe I'll just compare them next to each other. Right, so when you see the left and the right, you can see that the darks are much darker. So if we look, for example, here in the top, right, the reflection of the coral in the surface is much sharper than we see it on the left. And so that is what contrast does. It essentially makes the picture sharper. But if you go too extreme, you lose that detail again and it just gets black, right? So don't overdo it. That was my one example. And the other thing, which is also quite useful here, are the white tips. Let's see if we reduce our whites and our highlights, if we can make these white tips become a little bit more structured. And I have to admit that they are probably, yeah, I can do it a little bit. I will have to play a little bit, but you can see here now, when we zoom in the details, right, that we essentially, when we look at something here, that here we've got a bigger bleed on the whites than we have on the right. So we can save quite a bit as long as we use the highlights. So this is an example of using contrast and your highlights and your whites. See on the right side, see on the left side, you can see already that this looks a lot sharper. Like I said, don't overdo it. So if you did it too extreme, right, then it would start being too much black in here, and that's not pretty, right? Okay, now we're going to come to the last part. I see that we're already reached an hour, so my apologies, but this last part is pretty quick. That's basically sharpness. Essentially, underwater we lose a lot of detail, and that detail is not lost. It just needs to be recreated. Lightroom has a lot of tricks in the box. First one is called texture. Second one is called clarity. There's also sharpness, and then there's dehaze. I'm not going to talk about dehaze. Lots of people like using that, but that's cheating. So don't use dehaze. It doesn't really make a good photo. But texture and clarity is what you want to be using. Texture essentially increases the contrast, so like what we just did, but it does it on a pixelar level. It does it on really, really fine details, all the way down to the size of your eyebrows, the hairs, your hair detail, like my beard. All that would be increased by texture, and that is what Lightroom created it for. They created it to improve portrait editing. And so what you can do is you can edit details, or you can make them go away. So you can make the skin of your, the texture of your skin softer, or you can make it more structured with texture. Clarity is an similar format. Actually, it's a little bit older. It's been there for longer, and it is a little bit more on the mid-tone. So it's a bit further away from the granular level, and essentially texture is the latest. And so you should be using texture the most, because that was most recently added to Lightroom, and it's actually a magnificent feature. However, clarity does a few things that texture doesn't, so I actually suggest to mix the two. Finally, there is sharpness, and sharpness is actually done automatically by Lightroom. I will just show you one example in a moment where you might be changing that sharpness, but generally I would stay away from sharpness. Try to do everything with texture and clarity. The reason is because the more you do, you remember I talked about the bleed, the highlight bleed, essentially that happens on a granular level as well, and essentially your details just don't get that pretty. So here let's take a selfie from the Red Sea with this amazing wrasse that was super tame and just was coming really close. So I'm just going to show you the difference between 100% texture and 100% clarity. So if you look in the details, both of them really do a good job on the structure on the fish. If you just compare this with the previous photo, right, you can see the structure is extremely good. Oops, sorry, I'm jumping a little bit. What you can also see is texture is much better on retaining details without creating too strong contrast, particularly on my face. I know you have to look really close onto my face now, but if you look here, you can still see my skin texture. And this is 100% increase of this feature, which I never suggest. I would never go to more than 50. But if you look here, you can see my hair structure is very good. And you can even see some structure in my eyes. And this is already a zoomed in photo. Whereas if you look at the clarity, when you go here, you get much sharper contrast, and you can see that in this area around my cheek, a lot of detail is already lost. A lot of detail on the hair is lost. That is because in essence, you're getting a bleed, right? So therefore, texture is better for underwater, but don't overuse it. In both cases, what you're creating is a lot of backscatter because you're sharpening the whole image, and all floating particles, you can see that here in the back, are essentially also getting very granular. So granular backscatter essentially can make it more visible, more sharp, and we don't really want to do that. But with what we're learning today, I can't really take that away. So what you would do is you would use the sharpening that you want to do to make sure that the structure of the fish looks good. And then we would be using a tool to take care of this noise that we're creating, which you can see here. And this essentially is applying texture and clarity only to a certain area. And that is one of the tools I'll show you next week, Monday, which is partial editing. So we're going to use a brush so we can brush in the reduction of the detail into the blue area and keep the detail where we want it to be on the fish and on the diver. But that's going to be next week. But here you can now see we've now got, I did it very rough, but you can see here we've got still quite limited backscatter because it's now reduced, and the detail on the RAS is a lot better. So here I'm going to bring Michael's picture one more time for the sharpening feature. So what happens when you import your photos to sharpening? Essentially what happens is it automatically sharpens based on your camera model. And Michael, you've got the same camera as I do, the D850, and D850, the program actually applies quite a bit of sharpening. So the sharpening is something that you can then tell the program you want less of. And because you've got quite a lot of ISO noise, just because you were shooting at 2000, it was very dark, essentially you get quite a lot of noise here. And this would be the situation where you might want to reduce your sharpening, right? Because we've got all this noise. You might want to reduce the sharpening and increase, I didn't have the solution here. Oh, sorry, I'm missing a slide here. But essentially what you would do here, you would use noise reduction and color, sorry, it's not the right image in the back, to bring back the details. And you would reduce the sharpening. Sorry guys, that's not the right slide. I apologize. Here are the values. So if you're going to be using detail and contrast sharpening, make sure you don't go over 50. So the color and the luminance should maximum be 50. And that is all I'm going to say about this. In the fourth session, whoever is still there and still got the energy, we're going to talk about detail sharpening there in more detail. But for all of you guys, you can just use clarity and texture. So I'm just going to quickly show it, and then we're done, guys, for today. So let's just go here to another image. Let's just see what we can take. Let's just take this turtle, right? So again, I'm just going to do my quick white balancing, use a gray area. Too much red, make it a bit brighter overall. All right, you can see the fingers, guys, yeah? So I'm going to do the highlights down so that his fingers are not that bright. Okay, and now let's have a look what we can do in terms of clarity when we look at the turtle face. Okay, so if I press texture, look what happens with the eye. You can see now that the details inside the iris, you can see this structure here, all of that. If we have another look here on the, if you look at the fringe of the mouth here, of the beak, right? If you add clarity, you're going to get a lot more detail. Usually this is what I do. If it's a picture where you need it, I might add, you know, the 10-20% on the clarity. This is our original, and this is our details, right? You can see I've got the sharpening here. So sometimes I reduce the sharpening. You can see here in the background, we've got a little bit of haze. So if we have it like the program sets it, we just reduce it a little bit. If you want, you can do a little bit of noise reduction. It will actually merge this. And then essentially you get a nice sharp image of the turtle. That's really nice detail. And essentially that's what I wanted to share with you guys for today. So what we did today was white balancing, temperature, and tint, and color management, the 3 steps of white balance. We did brightness and darkness and sharpening. So it did take an hour, I apologize for that, but I am now ready for some more questions. I see almost, yeah, everybody's still here, so that's great. So you can either put it here in the questionnaire. I'm just going to go through the questions I just missed. We had some question about Lightroom Classic. Jose Luis, if you have Classic, but you've got, you don't have it updated in the last 2 years, as in you probably have a an old version or a illegal version, then texture wouldn't be there. Texture was only added last year. And this is one of the benefit, guys, of having the Adobe package, because essentially they do update a lot. I've been using Lightroom now for what, like 8-9 years, and it's really been improving every year. And these are the things you pay your subscription for. And last year when they added texture, it was a huge improvement, as you can see, because you can make things sharper without getting the downsides of sharpening. And so this is one of the advantages of having the edition. Also, if anybody has only the mobile version, like on your iPad, texture doesn't exist on the iPad. Okay, so that is one reason to have Classic. Essentially, there's a couple of other things that are not on the mobile app. So on Lightroom CC, the iPad, iPhone version essentially doesn't have a lot of features. But the most important one that they're missing is texture. I'm sure it will come soon, but at the moment you don't have it. Okay, Jose Luis, then you can send me a you can look into your preferences and see what your latest version is. Maybe you just need to update, and then texture should appear. Good to hear you don't have the illegal version. Guys, do we have any questions? If you don't have any other questions, I'm just going to pop in this other thing here because somebody asked me about this. So essentially, I'm going to offer one-on-one coaching, at least during this time while we're all at home. Essentially, if you want me to go through with you guys one by one through the program, or if you want to do individual editing, we can use Zoom. I can actually even switch controllers, so I could control your mouse and help you edit if you want to go through the image editing with me individually. But also if you want to go further, like discussing your portfolio, going through all of your images, like spending some good time, then you could then we could talk about that. And finally, we could also do something like competition submission if you want to get your photos ready. Anyway, if you want to do one-on-one coaching, then just let me know. I've got some different prices for that, but essentially we can split the hours as much as you like. So if you want to take an hour or 2 hours or 3, then we can split them out over whatever period you want. We can do 20 minutes there, 30 minutes there, but essentially we'll just be focusing on your photos on your computer only, and we can switch screens forwards and backwards one-on-one, which allows us to do some stuff in a bit more detail. Also, folks, I wanted to point out that we've got a couple more talks this week. So we've got our visiting, our friend of mine who runs Dive Ninja, similar company like mine in Baja California. He's going to talk about all the amazing stuff, the Makos, the Mobulas, the Marlins, and the whale trips that they're doing. Baja California is really hot right now, so that's a really great chat, non-technical. You can bring your kids or whatever. It's a different time because it has to work at his time. He's Pacific Western time, so he basically it will be early morning for Hong Kong. Then I'm hosting a talk on their platform, which is going to be shark photography, which is not anything to do with editing. Will all be about how to frame your shot, how to interact with sharks, etc., how to get your photo. So those two talks are this week. Next week, Monday, I hope all of you guys are here for Lightroom Part 3. We're going to do partial editing. That is super important tools. We'll see if we get it all done next week. I'll do my best, but otherwise we'll put that over into Lightroom Part 4, which will be in 2 weeks from today. And we've got a couple other talks. And just make sure you check Insider Divers or Insider Divers Academy, whichever, because I'm going to be posting more and more talks. So, folks, if there are any more questions, otherwise we could do another selfie if you guys want to try. But essentially, what you need to do is activate your video. Oop. You need to activate your video. Yeah, we can see. Is there anybody there who wants to do selfie? Okay, Radomir is there. Very good. So what you guys need to do is just activate your video. Great, lots of people here. I'm just gonna make the screen as big as possible. Supposedly I can get 48 people here. I don't really see how that works. Lots of people there. Wow, cool. Lena, Dodd. Oh, so many faces. Kaylee, Ava, Pauline, Karen. Wow, lots of faces. Great. All right, folks, what are we gonna do today? Do another selfie. Should we do something else this time? Last time we did okay. Should we do, what should we do? Should we do, what's that? Dodd, what's that? Oh, hammerheads. All right, hammerheads. Okay, we're doing hammerheads. Hang on, do the selfie. Everybody ready for the hammerhead? Manjula, you're the only one who's not the video on. Okay, we'll just take this photo without him. Okay, hammerheads, guys. I can't do the hammerhead. There you go, photo. Awesome, guys. I'm going to post this later. I'm going to tag whoever I can see. I can see somebody is driving again while watching Lightroom. Keith, is it? If you get in an accident, it won't be my fault. All right, guys. Thanks a lot for coming. Hope to see you on one of the other talks. Send me any questions you have, anything, just shoot it over. And otherwise, I'll hope to see you next week. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good one. Okay, so I think everybody should be able to hear me and see me now. So while we wait for the other people to join, we're just going to answer the questions that I got in the last couple of days. There were quite a few. So we're just going to go through those. The first question that we got was about the catalog. There were basically, I didn't touch it much last time because I don't really use much catalogs. I explained the concept with the XMP, which is also in the handout. So you essentially don't need catalogs. However, just because I got that question twice, I'm just going to try to explain it one more time, which is essentially what catalogs are. Sorry for the slightly crude animation here, but catalogs are essentially all the edits that you're doing on all of your photos separated from your images. So you will have your images on your hard disk somewhere, and whatever you do to them in Lightroom stays in the catalog. So your original images don't get touched. And the advantage is that once Lightroom has loaded all in there, not only does it remember what it's done, it's also preloaded images. So you can actually see small versions or high enough resolution images of your photos before the computer needs to load them. So it makes it also faster. The other advantage is you could have multiple catalogs. So you could have catalog 1, 2, or you could have catalog underwater, catalog above water, or photos for work or photos privately. I'm just going to show you where you would do that. I personally don't use it, but if you look here in the top left corner, found a cool zoom function here. So here you basically could open a new catalog or start a new catalog. And essentially you can see here, since 2014, I haven't changed my catalog because I just don't see the point. But other people switch between catalogs. So it's totally possible to do that. But you will see actually also with another question that I got, I am quite lazy when it comes to organizing. I just find that we spend enough time already on editing our photos. I just can't spend the time to also organize. So that's just my approach to things. So that was one question. So I'm just going to go back here to the questions. The other question, let me just see if Patrick is already here, because Patrick asked this question, so I will not answer that question until he's here. Some people are logged in without a name. So Patrick, if you're here, then just let me know. So I'll answer your question then. Then I also had a question about export sizing, and I think that person isn't here yet either. But I've got Michael's question, how to edit green photos. Michael, thanks for sending that photo. Where did you take that photo? You just have to press unmute. Michael? Otherwise we can talk about it later too.
I took it in Dubai.
In Dubai?
Yeah.
Wow, how deep was it?
40 meters?
40 meters. Okay.
Yeah, give or take.
So dark.
Yeah, it was a pretty green day.
Yeah, and if there's no sunlight, then you got to pump up that ISO, and that's going to create lots of noise. But I'm going to just answer that question a little bit later when we actually do the editing, if you don't mind. I'm actually going to edit your photo in front of everybody, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah,
thanks.
and I'll just show you a couple of tricks then. So we'll just cover that when we a bit later. Let's see. So we had this question about the collections by Patrick, but I don't want to answer that if he's not there yet. So we'll talk about export sizing. So I'm not gonna do anything here. I'm just gonna pretend I want to export this photo. People actually ask me this question in different ways. So essentially the question is, how should you export? And it's around the file setting and the image sizing where lots of problems kind of come up. And essentially, it's your decision how specific to the application you want to export. So say, for example, you want to export to put it on your website. Essentially, you want to keep the image relatively small. Then you would do resize to fit, and long edge is one good way of doing it. So if you wanted to do a photo that is, let's say, half of my 27 inch screen, then you would do, for example, 2048 pixels. If you wanted to do the full screen, you would do 4080, whatever that is, 96. Essentially, then that gives you the size of the image. So if you enlarge it any further, then it would start getting grainy. The second thing is the resolution, which is the DPI. And the DPI is, for web applications, usually 72, because the pictures are not supposed to be enlarged. I'm just lazy. I use 150 because 150 works for everything. And I don't resize my images in the long edge unless I get a specific request, for example, in competitions. Oh yeah, Manjula, you just joined me, so I'm just answering your question. Hope you can hear me. So unless I get a specific request to size the image to a certain size, I just don't do this part. I do percentage, I just leave it at that size, I set it to a DPI, and I limit the JPEG quality. The JPEG quality essentially is the size of compression, and I feel once it's small, well, around 5 megabytes, essentially it's good quality to upload to Facebook. Facebook will scale it down anyway. You can upload it to Instagram. Instagram will also scale it down. You can upload it to Dropbox relatively quickly, and Dropbox won't scale it down. And so that's why I find for most things, it's good to have this kind of file size with this resolution. Allows you to do everything. Essentially, you could even print from it. But the correct way would be to actually do it per application. So if you wanted to upload it to Facebook, for example, you should actually be doing 72 or websites. And then if you don't want to compress it by this mean, just putting a top end of the size, then you would have to decide what size you want it to go. And generally then I find 2048 is still pretty good, because that is essentially half the size of a big screen. So even if somebody looks at your Facebook photos with a big screen, they will see it. But I find that with 72 dpi, you can see the grain in the image. So that's why I export, not reducing it by size, but limiting the file size. But you can do it multiple ways. Essentially, this is a one-size-fits-all way that I use. So that was one question. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry, Manjula, I'm not sure how to say your name correctly. You can unmute if you want to add anything to your question.
No, all good. Thank you.
Okay. I also have a second question from you that actually also several people asked before. I did cover it last week, but I'll just show you real quickly how to do it again. Okay, so if you've got JPEGs and RAW in one folder, because your camera shot both of them, so I'm just going to open my, I'll just do it right in Lightroom. All right, so in Lightroom here for this week, I actually prepared a folder. Let me just get out of this. I prepared a folder where we have JPEGs and RAWs in it. Okay, so I just took it out of here and I'm going to re-import it. So I'm going to click import. Hope this is not too fast. Just going to zoom here. So import, right? I'm going to go to import. Now it's going to start giving me suggestions, and I called this folder JPEG compact. Okay, so here on the left, you can see this is the folder I'm selecting. And if you look, you can see that there are a couple of pictures as JPEGs, and then there's a couple of pictures as ARW. This is from the RX100 Mark V, the RAW format. And so you can see here now it's suggesting to import both JPEGs and RAW. So sorry, here 519, you can see they're both suggested to import. But now if you look here on the right side, there is this option here, which is called Don't Import Suspected Duplicates. So once I click that, see how my selection gets reduced, and oh, why is it only doing JPEGs? That didn't do it earlier. Now it's just doing JPEGs. That I cannot explain. It just earlier did the RAW. So actually what it should do now, it should just import the ARWs and not the JPEGs. Manjula, this is how it should work. I'm not sure why it's not working. I've re-imported this folder now a couple of times. I could only imagine that I've sort of not unimported it enough. Just try this and message me if it's not working. Yeah? But this is essentially the way how you avoid the importing it twice. Okay? So I'm just going to import all of them so I can figure out what this problem is. So I'm not sure if Patrick has joined yet, because he asked the question about collections. So I'm just going to answer it and it will just be in the recording. So Patrick asked me a question about how and if we should use collections. Collections is another way of sorting your images. Basically, there's two schools. Essentially, it's the school of just putting everything in a folder. I just put everything in a folder. Other people might like to use all the tools provided by Lightroom. And essentially, the Smart Collections is one way how you can sort your images without a folder structure. So if I go into Lightroom and you look here on the left, so you've got collections and you can see I don't actually use it, but you will have smart selections here. And for example, you could you could filter by all of your 5 stars across all of your folders. Obviously, this is including all of my hard disks. So apparently, I've got 22,358 5-star images. That is including all of my photos that I've edited in this catalog, right? You could create your own smart collection. So you would go here, smart collection, and then you would create a collection. For example, if you wanted to do all of your 2 stars, which is all my basically my pictures that I've messed up over time. So if I do that selection, then you can see that's 806 images. And then you can see, for example, one of my first that I've ever done as a selfie. And I don't know what was my image. So this is now on some hard disk, so it's not loading the full picture. But I think I'm not looking at the camera, for example, right? You can then sort that by different ways and just do a selection like that. The big advantage for smart collections versus folder structure is that if you go into the develop mode, these images are available. For some reason, Lightroom doesn't offer the folder view in the develop mode, just in the library mode. And so in develop mode, you can still use your collections if you wanted to. That would be, I would say, the main advantage. You can also create normal collections. So let's say we make a collection that we call underwater, and we don't want to make it a smart collection. So I'm just going to untick that one. And I'm not going to take this one. So I'm going to create a new one. You can see here now on the left, we've got an underwater category. Okay, so now if I were to go into my pictures from last week, for example, right? Now I could say I want this photo to be in my underwater. And now this would be in my underwater, and that is from folder 1. So if I would go into a folder from this week and also pull out 1 and make it into underwater, now 2 would be marked as underwater. And once I just click at these 2, then obviously I would just get this selection. So you could use that if you have time to make various collection, let's say all of your frogfish images or all of your shark images or anything like that. That would be an option to use. Okay, so I don't know if Patrick joined by now, otherwise he will see this in the recording. So I'm just going to go back to here.